Against History, Against Leviathan by Freddie Perlman. Chapter 2. An armored one asks, if the age of gold was so valuable, so beautiful, so pure, why did people leave it? If the civilized remember it, why don't they rush back to it? If it was so comfortable, why don't farmers throw away their plows and return to digging sticks? This same questioner also asks, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? There are answers to these questions, but the questioner does not want to hear them. He already knows the answer. Humanity left the state of nature because civilization is a higher stage. Higher stage of what? The armored one will never tell. He quickly turns to something else. The theory of the higher stage is as old as civilization itself. One of its more influential modern versions originated with a 19th century lawyer who lived in upstate New York, Lewis Henry Morgan, a consultant to speculating businessmen, a Republican politician, and a racist. Morgan nevertheless found time to do a study of his neighbors in upstate New York, devastated remains of once numerous Iroquoian communities. Morgan's racist predecessors, Washington and Jefferson, had insisted the Iroquoians were children, but Morgan thought the Iroquoians had reached a stage between childhood and adolescence. Morgan generalized his racism into a ladder, every rung of which gleams with racist polish. He made no effort to disguise his contempt. On the contrary, he flaunted it. Such contempt was, and still is, a mark of refinement in America. He named the lowest rung, the stage of infancy, savagery. He named the next rung, the stage of childhood, barbarism. And of course he named the top rungs civilization, the topmost American civilization. On the topmost rung sat Morgan with the great white race. The professors of America were so flattered that they elected Morgan president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The professors would later regret their vote. Morgan's racist ladder was borrowed by the agitator Karl Marx and the revolutionary businessman Friedrich Engels. Marx intended to patch the ladder but never found the time. It was Engels who patched Morgan's ladder. He didn't patch much. He borrowed the ladder intact, with all the racist polish of Morgan's nomenclature, savagery, barbarism, etc. Engels patched only the ladder's summit. He renamed Morgan's topmost rung, and he placed a yet higher rung above it. Engels changed the name of Morgan's great white race to capitalist class, and on the rung above it he placed the leaders and followers of Marx's political party. And in this form, Morgan's racist ladder became the official religion of the USSR, China, Eastern Europe, and other lands where the names of the rungs are stuffed into the heads of schoolchildren as a catechism. Of course, as soon as the agitators got hold of the ladder, American professors didn't want to be caught with their hands on it. They forgot Morgan. This is easily done in the places where memory is at the mercy of publishers of written words. But racism did not vanish from America, and Morgan's ladder was too good of a thing to leave to the agitators. The archaeologist V.G. Child, although himself a Marxist, gave the ladder an aura of respectability by filling its rungs with all the latest positive evidence. And the ladder came back to America, not quite as an official religion, but more as a last resort, as something to use in emergencies. Reference to the state of nature always creates emergencies. The ladder, the theory of higher stages, of course explains why people left the state of nature. That's what it is designed to do. The title of Engels' book, The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State, the explanation is simple, lucid, and in fact mechanical, and can be taught in elementary schools. All we have to do is look away from living beings and concentrate on things. The ladder is a thing, so are its rungs, and the connections between lower and higher rungs are also things. They're devices. Child misleadingly named his book Man Makes Himself, giving the impression that his subject was a living being. For Child, man himself is a thing, a container of objects and devices. Matter is the core, and man is the excreence. The device responsible for man's passage from the rung called savagery to the rung called barbarism is a gadget called the material conditions, or more fully, the level of development of the productive forces. This same device is responsible for the passages to all of the higher rungs. Marx and Engels, and also Morgan, lived at a time when the material conditions, literally the ground itself, slipped from under the feet of the former rulers. The hated barons and bishops, capitalist owners of mines and factories, were buying up the lands of the aristocrats. Marx and Engels prognosticated that the ground would similarly slip out from underneath the capitalists, and they projected their wish into the first dawn. In terms of this projection, man exists for thousands of generations as a savage. Then 300 or so generations ago, material conditions became favorable for something higher than savagery. These conditions included agriculture, metallurgy, the wheel, etc. Once he has all these things, man is able to generate a surplus product, a margin. Turner, too, succumbs to this part of the theory. This surplus, this margin, is what supports, literally feeds, the brave new world that now becomes possible. Kings, generals of armies, slave masters, bosses of labor gangs. Man had always wanted rulers, permanent armies, slavery, the division of labor. But he couldn't realize these dreams until the material conditions became ripe. And as soon as they did become ripe, all progressive-minded savages leapt unhesitatingly to the higher rung. Reader, do me a favor and re-examine the theory of higher stages first. Then tell me if you still consider my caricature exaggerated. This theory of higher stages can be taught to small children because it is a fairy tale. There's nothing wrong with fairy tales, but the proponents of this one claim that it is something else. They are contemptuous of fairy tales. The so-called material conditions were nothing but aids to feasting, walking, and floating. They were like canes to old men. Their variety and complexity attest to the ingenuity of human beings. But the centrality of such things to us is no proof of that human beings in the state of nature revolved around fruits, nuts, and canes. Little as we know of their great moments, we do know that they were not industrial fairs, celebrations of new inventions, gadget displays. Things may have been useful, but they were trivial compared to the moments when one made contact with the beginning, the source of life, being itself. The trivia are ancient, and may have been more varied in the old days than they are now. When fruit matured on high branches, all kinds of hooked poles, ropes, and ladders were devised to reach the fruits before monkeys could reach them. People knew themselves as cousins of animals. Many of their implements enabled them to copy the ways of animals. On the banks of rivers and lakes, people devised all kinds of rafts and canoes so that they could float like ducks and swans. They stored nuts for winter to use after the manner of squirrels. They scattered seeds after the manner of birds. They wove nets in the manner of spiders. They stalked deer after the manner of wolves. Wolves have stronger teeth and jaws. People sharpen sticks and stones. Our archaeologists picture them chipping away all day long like Zeks. We're projecting again. Those people were not coerced by what Tonby calls interpersonal institutions. They had no reason to go on chipping after that stopped being fun. Modern diggers have even unearthed the remains of ancient cities at places in Anatolia and the Levant, places later named Shanidar, Jericho, Katal, Huyuk, Halakar. At Shanidar, the whole community shared a cave as the winter shelter. The cave dwellers used metals. At Jericho, the people caved themselves in by building a wall, probably to protect themselves from hostile interlopers. These people seem to have done little or no planting. To the north of them were people who planted seeds and herded animals, but did not build cities or walls, and across the world from them were the ancestors and predecessors of the Ojibwa, who practiced metallurgy on Lake Superior, making beautiful copper ornaments and implements. None of these people developed interpersonal institutions. They remained kin. They went on sharing all they had and all they experienced. The copper users of Lake Superior did not plant seeds or herd animals. Perhaps they could have, but they had no earthly need to. They did have dogs. Dogs apparently domesticated themselves, either because of an incomprehensible love for human beings or because of a parasitic urge. But what satisfaction could come from developing strains of parasitic dog-like elk or moose? The material objects, the canes and canoes, the digging sticks and walls, were things a single individual could make, or they were things, like the wall, that required the cooperation of many on a single occasion. I would guess that the builders of the first Jericho's walls ceased to be the wall builders the moment they were done. They returned to more important activities. I would even guess they built the wall in order to pursue the more important activities undisturbed. As for the surplus product, the famous margin, these implements supposedly made possible, Shaolins and others have shown that communities with many implements and communities with few, in lush environments and in harsh ones, were all surrounded by surpluses. After all, the people had eaten to their fill. After all, the insects and birds and animals had eaten to their fill. There was still a virtual bounty that fell to the earth and fertilized the next spring's new shoots. Many animals and many people stored what they expected to use during the average winter, but no one hoarded more than that. Free people didn't need to. Most of the implements are ancient, and the surpluses have been ripe since the first dawn, but they did not give rise to interpersonal institutions. People, living beings, give rise to both. It is not man or mankind who is responsible, but one isolated community, a tiny minority in Toynbee's words. Furthermore, this tiny minority does not give rise to such institutions in the most favorable material conditions, say in the lush woodlands around the Great Lakes or the abundant forests of Africa and Eurasia. They do it in the least favorable material conditions, in a fiercely harsh environment. Diggers will actually unearth and decipher tablets which shed light on some of the first moments of interpersonal institutions. The tablets are in Sumerian, a language that may have originated in Central Asia. The authors are the first literate men. The villages where they live are called Erech, Urdu, and Lagash. The villages are located in the valley between the Tigris and Euphrates River. The place will be called the Fertile Crescent ages later, to explain why donkeys have tails. The first tablets don't speak of a place so favorably. They describe it as a hellish place, and make one wonder why those people stay there. They are set on farming in a jungle. The rivers flood yearly, fertilize the valley, and turn it into a swamp. Women plant seeds. One year, the flood is so violent that it carries off the crops as well as the houses. The following year, there's not enough water, and the plants dry up and die in the burning heat of the sun. Surely the villagers must start thinking of returning to the more favorable conditions of Central Asia, where they did not have to spend so much time and energy on mere survival, where they had time for more enjoyable activities. But they are tenacious. The grandmothers call the old men to a council. These men have been dreaming. The women urge the men to dream of a dependable water supply, neither too little nor too much. The men are undoubtedly offended at being called away from their mental transports for the sake of such trivia. They probably have to be called to a second council, then a third, this last during a famine. The old men sluggishly respond. They may have seen how beavers assure themselves a dependable water supply. They see what is needed is a dam, canals, and drainage ditches. But who is to build these? Certainly not the old men. They are not beavers. They call the young men together and explain the dream. The young men have been doing nothing at all, so they are eager to show themselves willing and generous givers. But no one knows how to proceed. The old men may or may not dream up the plans, but they certainly do not supervise the actual doing. They choose a strong young man, a lugal. They tell him to go look at the beavers. The old men return to their more important philosophical endeavors. The lugal, which means strong man in Sumerian, may or may not learn from the beavers, and he may or may not do the planning. He certainly does the supervising. Wasn't he designated by the elders? When the ditches and canals are dug, the lugal returns among his peers, proud but not yet haughty. Nothing has changed yet. Such cooperative ventures were infrequent, but not uncommon in communities of kin. But this is Erech, a place where the gods obviously don't want people to live. A single flood carries the whole works into the sea. The women called the old men to another council. This time the elders choose a yet stronger young man and urge him to study the beavers more conscientiously, or dream more profoundly. And this time the banks and dikes hold, at least initially, but Erech remains a materially wretched place, and before long the banks begin to crumble. The experienced lugal is called to repair the banks and dikes. The lugal and his cousins complain that they should have been called a moon sooner, when the banks were still repairable. Now they'll have to rebuild the entire works. This happens twice, at most 3 times, before the lugal insists on having a seat at the council of the elders, so as to have a say in choosing the time to repair the dikes. Spring passes, and winter passes, filled with feasts, festivals, dances, and games. The elders of and even those of Lagash designate lugals to go study the irrigation works of Erech. One elder of Erech and another dies of old age. They are replaced on the council by newcomers. By now, the lugal is a more experienced elder than that of the newcomers, and he expresses himself about other things than dikes. He becomes haughty, and his cousins stand behind him. He and they, after all, are the ones who provide Erech with such a dependable water supply. The lugal even dares to tell an old grandmother where not to plant her seeds. One day the lugal is found dead, murdered by a deity known to be in close contact with that of the insulted grandmother. A new lugal is chosen, a less haughty one, and the elders are more careful to keep him out of the council. There is no positive evidence of any of this. The fact is that the Sumerian tablets are mysteriously silent about the deeds of the women and the elders at the time of the first lugals. And as time goes on, the tablet scribes help people forget that Sumerian women were important, that elders once sat at the council, that there was an age before the first lugal. But I'll return to my story. The people of and those of Lagash have completed their waterworks. These grow more extensive every year. One year, the drainage ditches of Lagash overflow into Ur's canals, flooding and ruining Ur's works. This so infuriates the lugal of called lugal, that he leads his spear-armed cousins against those of Lagash. The enraged youth of destroy their neighbors' waterworks and pursue fleeing Lagash people into the desert. In their rage, they murdered several foreigners, desert nomads whose paths they cross. When at last the besieged Lagashians beg for an end to the violence, the victors, lugal, at their head, impose a fiendish, heavy burden on the defeated. The men of demand reparations from the Lagashians, who are to rebuild their own waterworks and those of as well. Lagashians, unwilling or unable to support the burden, are invited to bring large gifts to the man of at specified periods. Lugal is determined to keep track of all the tribute gifts owed to him, for he is tenacious of those ancestors of his who did not abandon the Fertile Crescent. To keep track of the gifts and the givers, he sends one or two of his cousins to Eric to study the marks some of the Lugal's men have been marking on clay tablets to keep track of the best times to repair the dikes. Lugal's men soon make clay tablets of their own, and onto these tablets they chisel wedge-shaped marks to signify the names of those in Lagash who still owe tribute gifts, and the amounts. All these events did not happen in the single Lugal's lifetime. Lugal is only one of the names of Lugals. The Sumerians have hundreds, perhaps thousands of Lugals, and the scribes invent yet more names of Lugals to fill the time between themselves and the first dawn. For the Sumerians, the interval between themselves and the beginning is not as brief as it will later become for the Christians. The tenacious Sumerians reckon in millions. I latched on to Lugal because of his telling name, so I'll stick with him. He's still collecting tributes from Lagash. His nephews are having a ball supervising the canal works of their neighbors, instead of doing it themselves. Now alarming news arrives. Some of Lugal's cousins went hunting, perhaps in the forests of Lebanon. One of them returns, with barely enough life in him to tell the tale. The hunters were attacked by spear-armed nomads. All were killed but the teller. The attackers were probably kin of the foreigners killed of Lugal's men during the foray against Lagash. Lugal immediately prepares to lead his strongest cousins against the murderous foreigners. The elders try to cool the hotheads, suggesting that the foreigners were avenging the victims of Lugal's initial raid, and another raid will only lead to more reprisals. But the hotheads will not be stopped. Lugal and his cousins, still flushed by their victory over Lagash, set out towards the Lebanon forest. They actually find the camp of foreigners. They raze it to the ground and murder most of the nomads. On their way back with the captured animal herds, the men of are attacked by another band of foreigners. The forest seems to teem with foreigners. Lugal and many of his cousins are killed. The survivors abandon their loot and flee back to in disarray. All is enraged. Someone reminds the angry crowd of the elders' predictions, and he is immediately killed. The survivors and their cousins clamor for the appointment of the strongest and most determined amongst them as lugal. The victors over Lagash will not be bested by mere foreigners. They will not be flies to spiders who live in no cities and plant no seeds. The council of elders, beset by the entire town's rage, hesitantly appoint a new lugal. The enraged warriors set out against the foreigners. They send scouts ahead so not to be trapped in another ambush. They transport their supplies as well as Lugal himself on wheeled carriages, and the men from can move faster than any foreigner. They find several camps of nomads and raze every one to the ground. They return to this time not only with captive herds, but with captive foreigners as well. The returning warriors are embraced by their worried kin. For a fortnight, all of is taken up with feasts, dances, and celebrations. The elders, men and women, prepare generous offerings to the spirits and powers who made victory possible. Special offerings are made to the Lugal's deity. When the celebration ends, the flushed warriors, the heroes, are not about to return to repairing the canals. The stint of Lagashians is about to end. In fact, the Lagashians are complaining that they've already done more for than they even agreed to. Who will do the repairing now? The Lugal's cousins had long been supervising defeated Lagashians, and they're not pleased with the prospect of replacing the defeated. The captured foreigners are put to work on the canals. Each of the Lugal's cousin is now a Lugal, a supervisor. The Sumerian word is ensi. This is a sub-Lugal, an assistant to the Lugal, a boss but not the boss. Nomads continue to harass the Ur's hunters and travelers, but news of their raids is no longer alarming. The lugal leads frequent expeditions against the unintelligible, Semitic-speaking foreigners. The elders no longer object to these expeditions, prudently confining themselves to visionary and philosophical activities. Occasionally, the lugal consults an old man or woman about the likelihood of victory, but otherwise he keeps a respectful distance from them. The lugal now looks forward to these expeditions, for each new raid brings new foreigners to Ur. There are now enough foreigners in Ur to repair the canals in every season. Soon the captives from the earlier expeditions are recruited to the expeditions against the new raiders. Now foreigners do not only repair dikes, they also repair the houses of old men and women. They do the lugal's chores, and soon the chores of enesses. Sumerian women still give birth to the plants in the field. But now they do this by maintaining close and continual contact with earth and with the spirits responsible for nurturing the plants. The actual scattering of seeds is done by the captured foreigners. And who are these foreigners? Surely we can recognize them as the first sex. They are workers, proletarians, full-time laborers. The Sumerian language comes from another age. Just as it has no word like king, ruler, emperor, president, it has no word for zek, worker, slave. Sumerians continue to call the lugal, lugal, and they continue to call the foreigners, foreigners. But in an incredibly short time, Ur abandons the exotic world of seers and visions. I have been using the present tense. Ur is now. It is not exotic at all. It is our world. What happened? I've already disposed of the Marxist explanation. Favorable material conditions did not give rise to the first lugal of Uruk. Material conditions remained what they were for generations, and the people of Uruk had no access to the best of them. Material conditions began to change only after the first lugal, and from then on they changed fast. Pierre Clatrius will say that there was a revolution, not a material, but a political revolution. This is a good way to put it, but it is true only in retrospect. The Sumerians obviously undergo a great change. We can call this a revolution, but they did not experience it as one. From the standpoint of the Sumerians, nothing changes. In a sense, they never leave the state of nature. This is probably what accounts for the exoticism that will continue to cling to what we call early civilizations. The Sumerians haven't become Zeks. They're still possessed. Sumerian women still give birth, not as machines for the production of soldiers and workers, but as living beings in close contact with the sources of being. Sumerian men, especially older ones, still seek contact with the spirits of the wind, the clouds, and even the sky itself. In fact, they devote themselves to their searches more completely than they ever could before. Now all their energies are devoted to the dances, festivals, and ceremonies. They no longer have concerns themselves with the trivia of material survival. The trivia are all done for them. Furthermore, the lugal and his men bring far more generous gifts to the spirits than could ever be given before. The lugal's men have even built permanent shrines to all the spirits and powers, incredibly beautiful shrines. And around the shrines they've placed gardens and filled them with all the creatures of the deserts and forests. Never before have the people shown such homage, such respect, to the beings responsible for life. It is true that the lugal builds the greatest shrines to his own deity. This is obviously presumptuous on the haughty lugal's part, since he cannot know that the spirits accept the hierarchic arrangement into which he places them. This is a type of revolution, but the Sumerians are not going to turn against the lugal for his haughtiness. They've gotten used to it, and instead of irking them, it now makes them smile with a certain pride. It is thanks to him that they can now devote themselves so completely to the well-being of their city. I have to admit to my questioner that the Sumerians would not part with a single one of their new implements. They do not long to return to a timeless golden age. They are in the golden age, more so now than ever before. But the golden Sumerians are no longer all of Sumer. In fact, in some later scholarly accounts, the golden Sumerians will not even exist. They will be dismissed with a single word. The word is temple. The devotees of Inanna, the loving daughter of the moon, the communicants of Anu, the spirit of the sky, are not the users of the new implements. They are not the administrators of the irrigation works, the builders of the great palaces, the heroes of the military encounters. They are what we will call priests and priestesses, oracles and diviners. All that is left of Sumer, from the state of nature, has shrunk into what we will call religion. Perhaps some of the women who no longer scatter seeds, perhaps some of the men who no longer hunt or herd, feel some nostalgia for the old days. But there is no evidence of a back-to-the-land movement amongst the Sumerian clergy. The scribes who chisel the tablets are the lugal's hired men. They are not hired to record the nostalgia of the clergy. The only clues we have are the gardens, which the lugal's men build and fill for the temple's residents. These temple gardens are mysteriously lush for small towns, surrounded by non-urban vistas, and in the walking distance from forest and mountains. And the Sumerians are such good walkers. Could it be, as Turner will suggest, that the world outside the city is already becoming a wilderness? We should look carefully. The world outside is not the wilderness our word will designate. Their wilderness is clearly not the forest or desert, the plants or animals, since the nature-loving temple residents have all these and brought them into the city. Could it be that the wilderness is the wilderness created by the lugal and his men, the battlefield surrounding all of Sumer's towns, the setting of raids and counter-raids, the scenes of torture, slaughter, and capture? A priestess who wants to commune with the moon by the forest pond would have to set out with an armed escort. It has become more practical to bring a shrunken pond in the forest into the precincts of If the former free community has shrunken to a temple, an excrescence that community has grown extremely large, for the temple is now surrounded by a bustling city, almost modern in every way except in its religion. Perhaps not altogether modern, but at least perfectly intelligible to us. There are rich and there are poor, since the families of Anises are no kin to the foreigners, and share nothing with them. There is a market, since the well-to-do no longer gather, grow, or hunt their own food. There are generals and there are soldiers. There are record-keepers. There is even a school for scribes, and it all runs like clockwork. Let's look more closely. If the people in the temple are golden, those outside are of baser metals. The Semitic-speaking members of the labor gangs, married with one or more children, not quite Sumerianized yet, remember better days. It might not be altogether insane to suppose that these first Zeks love their Anises no better than later Zeks will love theirs. Some of the victories celebrated on the tablets are against foreigners already in Sumer. In other words, they were victories over rebelling Zeks. The foreigners are maltreated, overworked, and despised. They are neither free nor whole. They are the dispossessed. Some of their children might face a brighter future, especially those who go to war and butcher other foreigners bravely enough. The Sumerians have not yet progressed to a higher stage of hereditary misery. Even so, the lot of the Sumerian Zeks is in no sense golden. Rousseau, and before him de la Bodie, will wonder about situations like these. In any given labor gang, there are many Zeks and only one NC. What keeps the Zeks from ganging up against the NC? Why do people reproduce a miserable daily life? Let's glance at the NCs. They are materially well off, but they are beset by fears, and at least one NC is paranoid. He's afraid to be murdered by Zeks in his gang. He has already executed several conspirators. He's afraid word of his incompetence might reach the lugal. And, the gods forbid, he suspects someone in temple nurses a grudge against him. There's something else about the NC. The Zeks aren't free or whole, but neither is he, except when they rise, or gang up against the NC. The Zeks are not determined by their own nature or being, by their own choices or wishes. The tasks they spend their days are not of their own, but those tasks aren't the NC's either. The NC knows of a work gang whose supervisor was murdered by Zek conspirators. The murdered man was replaced by a man with a different outlook and altogether different interests. Yet once he was supervisor, the new man did the same things as the murdered supervisor, and in almost the same manner. Strange thoughts come from the NC's mind. Could it be, he wonders, that the only man in who is his own man is the lugal? Now he wonders even if this is true. He has heard of the town whose lugal was killed, along with most of the NCs, in an uprising of Zeks. When the NC first heard the story, he wasn't surprised that there was an uproar, that many of the activities which emanated from the lugal's will came to the standstill. But now he remembers that very few activities came to a complete halt, even during the interregnum between lugals. He even remembers that no council of elders replaced the dead lugal. The elders stayed in the temple and locked its gates. Many of the town's activities, important ones at that, went on as before, like the clockwork of the NC's descendants. Yet stranger thoughts come from the NC. It seems to him that the town has a will of its own, but he knows it doesn't. The only one in town with a will is the lugal. The NCs only execute the lugal's will, and if the Zeks have a will at all, it is the will to break out. The NC concludes that it is pointless to think. Thinking is a job of priests and oracles. One of the NC's distant descendants, in a much later a scribe called Thomas Hobbes, will know that the NC is trying to understand civilization with the ideas that come from the state of nature. This Hobbes will know that is no longer in a state of nature. It is no longer a community of self-determined human beings. Hobbes will know that is no mere city. Is a state, maybe even the first state. And a state, Hobbes will say, is an artificial animal. It is something brand new, something neither man nor nature dreamt of. It is, quote, that great Leviathan called a commonwealth, or state, in Latin civitas, which is but an artificial man, end quote. Like the thinking Ensi, Hobbes will know that this artificial man has no life of its own, and he will ask, may we not say that all autonoma, engines that move by themselves, by springs and wheels, as doth a watch, have an artificial life? The Ensi cannot yet visualize a watch. The more advanced Hobbes will no longer be able to visualize nature or human beings. He will ask, what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels? In a world of watches, the Leviathan will not appear as strange to Hobbes as it appears to the Ensi. Hobbes will picture the Leviathan as an artificial English man, masculine, blonde, with a crown on its head, a scepter in one hand and a sword in the other, its body composed of a myriad of faceless human beings, Zeks. Hobbes will insist that the Leviathan has a head of a man. He might agree with the yet later poet Yeats that the beast has a lion's body and the head of a man, but he will insist on the man's head. He will know that the Zeks are headless, that they are the springs and strings that operate the body. He will think the monster contains one free and whole man, the lugal. Hobbes will be able to call the lugal a king, monarch, ruler, and other names besides, because his language will have been enriched by the intervening proliferation of leviathans. The philosophical Ensi already knows better than Hobbes that the beast has neither the body nor the head of a man, whether English or Sumerian. The Ensi knows that even the lugal, the freest of man and cannot go hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon, and dancing at night, as his own spirit moves him. He knows of a lugal who went off hunting only twice. The second time the lugal was in the woods, his favorite Ensi replaced him as lugal, and the former lugal had to beg for asylum in a neighboring city. The Ensi knows that a lugal who lets himself be determined by his own spirit would quickly be overthrown by Ensis, or even Zeks, and that the temple would be in uproar. The Ensi, less advanced than Hobbes, is yet more familiar with living beings than with springs and watches. He cannot envision the Leviathan with either a human head or a lion body. He might use Hobbes's first description and think of the beast as an artificial animal, but not an animal as graceful or as limber as a lion. He might think of it as a worm, a giant worm, not a living worm, but a carcass of a worm, a monstrous cadaver, its body consisting of numerous segments, its skin pimpled with spears and wheels and other technological implements. He knows from his own experience that the entire carcass is brought to artificial life by the motions of human beings trapped inside, the Zeks who operate the springs and wheels, just as he knows the cadaverous head is operated by a mere Zek, the head Zek. Among the speculations this Hobbes will give us as offerings to his will be the claim that the Zeks actually contracted themselves to imprisonment within the carcass, or as he will put it, that the head made an agreement with the body, if not in Hobbes's then at least in the original The philosophical Ensi, who has by now retired to the temple, already knows better. He knows the Zeks are foreigners who were brought to by force before they even understood the lugal's language. The Zeks agreed to no contract then, and they haven't done so since. The Ensi even remembered that the defeated Lagacians, who contracted themselves to repairing canals, made this agreement only at the point of spears. Furthermore, no lugal ever advanced Hobbes's claims. He would have been laughed out of office. The lugal knows that even the elders didn't appoint him, since the elders no longer do any appointing. They take care of the shrines. The lugal claims that his power comes to him from the violent spirit who lodges in the ziggurat or artificial mountain. This sprawling, man-made phallus shape is the real head of the Leviathan, and it has made no contracts.